Greetings, Internet. I shall be today performing a reading for you from my phenomenal essay, Desolation, Redemption, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and versus the Enlightenment. This essay won Internet Best Essay of Philosophy of all time. And I shall be reading it for you. It concerns the character of Søren Kierkegaard. Søren, or as they say in the Dane pronunciation. Say it with me. Say it with the Dane pronunciation. Søren Kierkegaard. That was how they mocked this young man upon the schoolyard. People have said, why don't you wear more blazers when you create your beautiful content? And I said, because I feel like a game show host. But I decided today I will wear a blazer for you, beloved followers and fans. And I shall perform a dramatic reading of my essay for you in a blazer. And beloved followers and fans, because you requested Søren Kierkegaard, I shall be speaking upon him in the second of our hour, the second half of this beloved, beautiful video. We will cover Søren Kierkegaard, the present age on the death of rebellion, which is a very prophetic book. I was kind of blown away. I read it yesterday, and I thought that would make a great topic for discussion. So thank you to the beloved lady who requested Søren Kierkegaard. But we must also compare him to Nietzsche and Dostoevsky because he's in that era of continental philosophy. In the course of what is now titled Continental Philosophy, three figures stand out as preeminent thinkers able to probe the innermost depths of the human psyche. Perhaps in a way previously unknown to, somebody like Shakespeare, maybe? Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky. They were more or less contemporaries, and they all shared a similar fascinating interest, that of tearing down the ideological idols of their day. Something that you see me humbly doing, my friends. And in particular, they wanted to tear down the facade of the post-Enlightenment individual modern man and what he conceived of himself to be. Now, while these men certainly had differing worldviews and they would have likely debated grand narratives such as the existence of God, morals, whether Dr. Bill Cosby was himself guilty or framed, nevertheless, they shared a similar distaste for the hypocrisy, lies, and absurdity of the authorial, iconoclastic nonsense that they shared a similar distaste for hypocrisy, lies, and the falsehood, and they made it of their day, and they made it partly their authorial, iconoclastic goal to tear down these idols. My acting is coming to the fore. I'm starting to cry, to weep, perhaps, for you, beloved viewers. Francis Bacon, 1 degree of separation from Kevin Bacon, made it his goal as early as the early Enlightenment luminary to tear down what he perceived to be the idols in his novum organum, the idols of the tribe, the cave, the marketplace, and the theater. Idols of the tribe meant the destruction of abstracted social ideas foisted upon reality. Idols that referred to myopic interpretations of reality according to the particular fancy of some individual academic. The idols of the marketplace referring to the misappropriation of word and thing. Idols of the marketplace I already did that. Assigning an undue identification between the two, assuming that our out-talking of an opponent is what has caused the reality of the topic under discussion to actually be true. Idols of the theater, by which he meant there were idols erected on false presuppositions of theology or metaphysics and becoming ensconced in public discourse. The tractate encompasses the impetus of the Enlightenment and its obsession with what René Guénon would eventually call reign of quantity. And I must mention that reign of quantity was anticipated by the present age. A lot of similarities there. It also anticipates nihilism by Father Rose. So scientific knowledge, more specifically scientism, would become the dominant paradigm by which all things would be measured. Religion, politics, economics, and even the market, of course. It's a market dominance. All things in potentia are capable of rational formalization, and like a giant algorithm, humanity's ills simply await the solution of the academy and its lab calculators in their mythical, magical vestments or lab coats. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Nietzsche. Nietzsche. These Nietzsches. Kiss these Nietzsches. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky would make this same methodology Kierkegaardici. We could just say Kierkegaardici. Put them all together into a strange triad of key figures. It is possible that Bacon and his Enlightenment progeny were guilty of this very thing as he sought to destroy. Did the philosophs erect idols of their own, however? In other words, did Bacon erect a scientific idol? Well, yes, he did. But for Nietzsche, the influence of Kierkegaard must first be mentioned. Kierkegaard struggled with the complacency and formalism of the Lutheran official church of his day, as well as critiquing the Roman church. He went on an introspective journey that would cause him to question nature itself. The nature of the self, nature itself, etc. Kierkegaard did not, however, analyze the self as some kind of privileged, abstract, scientific entity, something to be found like Descartes' cogito. It's not a scientific quality that you can find under a microscope. This is why I said that monistic, atheistic views lead to a non-rational, purely contingent principle of individuation, which doesn't work, and thus atheism and monism and scientism are completely destructive of the possibility of knowledge whatsoever. Rather, in a dialectical relationship, the self is in a definitive way or mode defined in its relation to the other. In the sickness unto death, the self must come to despair the sickness, and reveling in its own finitude, it must find solace with an infinite God. For Kierkegaard, the only way to escape from the continual dialectic that fallen man is trapped in, by virtue of being a son of Adam, is to find God. Critic Merold Westphal explains, for these three secular masters of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, the illusions must be unmasked as self-interested masquerading parties of duty and virtue, right? You do what you do out of duty and virtue, but those are hypocrisy. Nietzsche's example of the spirit of ressentiment giving rise to a demand for revenge, but posing as love and justice, is just this kind of paradigm. Sin is no more than selfishness vis-a-vis my neighbor. It is also the failure to love God with all my heart. Neighbors, 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 neighbors. Have you heard of the Rolling Stone? Inevitably, this human self-deception includes the will to be autonomous from God and to dominate my neighbor. Dear friends, do we want to be dominatrices over our neighbors? My boomer neighbors do, because they make noise all the time, banging on the walls. Inevitably, the introduction to the story adds a whole new dimension to the art of suspicion. Herein enters Nietzsche's departure from Kierkegaard while explaining his art of suspicion. Remember that rather than to succumb to a moral system that leads to the inevitable failure and misery in the Christian scheme, according to Nietzsche, this fomenting in resentment and hatred for others under the guise of love plunges us further into the sickness to find salvation from the self that is supposedly created good by God. Nietzsche thus turns Kierkegaard's suspicion into a Christian morality itself. It turns it upon itself as well as upon the entire Enlightenment. For Nietzsche, the Enlightenment had given rise to critique, the art of critique, or the art of suspicion. Kulturkritik, eventually, in the Frankfurt School. And in doing so, it tossed aside God. This is the meaning of the famous God is dead phrase. Rather than being a factual claim, Nietzsche obviously meant that metaphysics is gone. It's a descriptive statement about the current future of Western civilization and its relationship to the Judeo-Christian God. By that I mean the Old Testament in its continuity with the New Testament. The Enlightenment had successfully critiqued, I'm not talking about Ben Shapiro. The Enlightenment had successfully critiqued previous metaphysical theological assumptions inherited from Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Augustine, and Aquinas, only to find itself seeking a grand narrative that amounted to the exaltation of an idealized, abstracted view of man. And this is exactly the locus of the critique in Kierkegaard's present age. Abstracted man, abstracted public, abstracted press for the leveling of society. It's the point of that book. And that's why he was prophetic in an amazing way, as we'll see in part 2 of this talk if you subscribe, as we cover this present age, how he predicted the internet, or the internet age. Al Gore invented the internet. Kierkegaard predicted it. Kierkegaard. This idea of abstracted ideas in the philosophy of Kant, for example, involved extrapolating a categorical moral imperative that should logically lead to a world government where humanity is guided by reason and harmony into a scientistic free market utopia. That's what Kant thought. Yet with Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoyevsky, I can't do it. We begin to see a problem with his abstraction. Descartes' cogito was not something that Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, or KND, NKD, North Korean dictator, could completely avoid. The seeds of individualism had been laid. Descartes, himself a rationalist, could not have foreseen the existential dilemma that his cogito would create. But his turning of man's gaze in upon himself to deconstruct the psyche would result in the existentialists deconstructing the mythos of the Enlightenment. There's a great quote by Yale scholar Louis Dupré, where he says, for Descartes, the truth of nature becomes established in the mind's reconstruction of it. The mind functions as a mirror, this is Platonism, wherein the reflection of truth originates as the reflection of all things. But if so, how can the mind know itself? Pierre Gassendi wondered. The physical eye, incapable of seeing itself directly, nevertheless is able to see things in a mirror. For Descartes, there is no mirror beyond the mind. If we do not know the nature of the mirror, the mind, however, how can we evaluate its capacity for reflection and the true nature of things? In this objection lies the entire problem of knowledge as representation. Unless the eye knows itself, how could it know the end and what it reflects? What allows the mind to refer to the mirrored image to an original if it ignores how it reflects the original? How can we know that there's a self if the self is not itself seen in the reflection of our minds, right? This is a similar question that a lot of philosophers have asked, the philosophy of the self. How do we know that we have a self, consciousness, etc.? Again, you can begin to see the doubts in Descartes. Descartes felt that the objection went to the heart of the theory that the mind's mirror reflects itself. So ultimately, instead of locating things in the mind of God, we're on this project of making man's mind omniscient. Man's mind is the source of the Platonic ideas in this scheme. Your mind is the matrix, dude. The mind possesses no more than an awareness, however, of its existence. It doesn't have a direct perception of itself. Does that suffice for justifying the knowledge of things in themselves through an act of mirroring in the mind? Locke himself perceived the difficulty of this and stated that the mind knows only ideas, which leads to solipsism. Right? Empiricism leads to this absurd conclusion, solipsism. So Enlightenment thinking here begins to collapse in on itself. It begins to become evident that abstracted, quantified measurement of all reality in a reductionistic fashion Whether making all reality into matter or ideas, it ends in a conundrum of solipsism or monism. Solipsism is not the kind of position Enlightenment rationalists would like to adopt, since it is a fundamentally irrational position. Kierkegaard recognized that the self was dialectically related to itself and other selves, and ultimately to the other self, God. And he saw in this, through this, that its inability to find solace and meaning could only be had through a kind of individualistic justification by faith in a Lutheran scheme. Nietzsche bites the bullet and simply rejects all of this in toto. In other words, not Toto the dog, but in toto. In toto. In toto. In total. In other words, why is the self considered as evil in Christianity? According to Nietzsche, it's not, but Nietzsche took a dualistic, you can see that Zoroastrian perspective there, that the self nature is evil in Nietzsche's mind. Which, by the way, I think that the Platonic conception, the Hermetic Platonic conception of Western Hermeticism leads to that conclusion. You either are led to pantheism and the worship of nature, or you're led to deism and the rejection of nature and Gnosticism. That's the result of the simplicity doctrine. I have an essay, by the way, on Kierkegaard and dialectics and Augustine. If man is inherently sinful in Nietzsche's conception, then didn't God know this about man from the beginning? And the idea of a payment of an infinite debt by sacrificing himself to pay himself becomes an exercise in absurdity in Nietzsche's mind. Christianity had, in the scholastic period, become a byproduct of this notion, and this led to the Enlightenment. It had been gradually arguing itself away from Christ's redemption into an absurd, irrational rationalism. And then by the same reasoning, it rejects rationalism by the arguments of reason itself, irrational rationalism. This quandary was not readily accepted by the deists and moralists of Nietzsche's day, yet Nietzsche was not afraid to call out those deists and scientistic proponents for their contradictions on their own grounds. Exactly. If the Enlightenment meant that God was dead as an ontological reality, then there was no coherent reason to hold on to Christian moralism. And in fact, these morals were themselves destructive and retrograde in terms of those who were actually strong. Christianity, in his mind, was a slave morality par excellence, as he argued in the first and second essays of Genealogy of Morals, as well as in The Twilight of Idols and Antichrist. In fact, the entirety of Western civilization had started from the false presuppositions of the ascetics, he calls them, Plato and Aristotle, who sought to flee the reality of the present world into flights of fancy and abstractions. From Plato, the West was given a dialectical nightmare, which could only take a few millennia to recover, if it could even be called a recovery. Rather, it led to self-implosion. The modern atheistic scientism that resulted was no better. It leads to nihilism, right? And it was more contradictory than those in Christendom. In the third essay of the Genealogy of Morals, he takes up the absurdity of the ascetics, which includes the Enlightenment luminaries and the mediocre Germans of his days.
The mediocre Germans of his day! The mediocre!
For Nietzsche, the Enlightenment cast off Christendom as a grand narrative and gave explanatory power to the seemingly random and harsh facts of life. But this was not an entirely lamentable fact. This removal of the idols of Bacon himself would be a tough pill to swallow and would lead to a kind of nihilism, as Dostoevsky predicted, as did Kierkegaard. Man's salvation could then perhaps be found in art, or in a rise of an artistic elite who could create new meaning. There was no determined necessity of any of this happening, of course. It is entirely possible that man might devolve, as we've seen, into tech-nihilism. But this progressive evolutionary theory that man might devolve, again, goes against an Enlightenment myth of never-ending progress, as we saw in Huxley. Julian Huxley. There is no law of progress present in the brute factuality of an impersonal, irrational, chaotic universe. For Nietzsche, this overman who might come would bring redemption, a kind of antichrist, to fix the world over against the collapse of Western Christendom. As he says in his analysis, Christianity